welcome. We're at Masters of the Journey. We're doing a video conference interview with Don Ley. And Don Ley is a very special man. He's got a great history. We're going to hear a little bit more about his background. And then we're going to hear about a very interesting near-death experience that he had 4 years ago, and the kind of information that he received and brought back with him. And then with time, we'll find out how this goes about not only changing his life, but is information that can help all of us. My name is Dr. John Mason. I'm the founder of Masters of the Journey. And with us, we have Paul, just joined us. And we also have Paula, who is my professional assistant. But more than that, she happens to be the author of a book. What's the name of the book, Paula?
It's called Guided to the Higher Realms, A Personal Journey of Ascension Through Meditation.
And I would grab it, but I don't have a copy in front of me.
Actually, I just happen to have it.
Oh
I didn't plan this, but here it is.
There. Which is going to be very helpful for us. So, hi, Paul. We've got Paul on the line now. I can see you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Paul.
Okay.
I want to hear from Don. You've been involved with spiritual growth and development for quite a while. Could you just give us a brief overview of where you've been? And that might help lead us into why you've had the experience that you've had.
Okay. Well, God, if I want to go back to the beginning, I guess I'd go back when I was quite a small child, 4 or 5 years old. I have some memories from there that I couldn't really talk to anybody about, and those sort of hung around through my life. And as I went through school and got through university and started a career, it was still there. And so in about, I guess it was about 67, 68, something like that, I met a man and we got to know each other pretty well, and decided to start to explore what was available out there on these other levels, with meditation, with all of the spiritual things. And so we dove in, and eventually what I did after a couple of years was I left my career and spent 3 years traveling around the world, touching in different places, different disciplines. I didn't feel like I was on a big search. It was more like an exploration. Let's see what's out there. And then coming back, and I started working with people one-on-one that were interested in their spiritual growth, what we were calling at that time spiritual growth, and still are. That led to eventually starting to teach classes, which was in about 77, I think, and went through some training, and ended up opening a center where I was teaching and doing healing work, a conglomeration of all the things that I'd experienced, and trying to put those into practice some way, and also trying to help other people open up to these other realms or these other parts of themselves. And so the focus was always one of who are you really? That had always been a question for me. Who am I beyond this thinking, feeling body that I'm experiencing? And what other realms can I start to touch into? And what do I need to do to make it real for myself, that there's more to me than just this body, just this thinking. And to me, it all came down to, could I experience it? And I think that's one of the key elements through all of this. It's not thinking about it. It's not it has to do with how much can you let yourself experience, which to me just says you need to open yourself up somehow beyond the limitations that you've got set in your mind, the concepts that you've been raised with, the parameters that we live within our own society. And I remember when I came back from that 3 years of traveling around the world, and I kind of, when I landed back in Seattle and we were being driven out to somebody's house where we were going to stay for a few days. And I remember just thinking at that time, very vivid memory of this, thinking, I'll never see the world the same again. It was like, because I experienced it, and the way that I experienced it was different than the images that I had in my mind about how I might experience each of the places. And one of the key things I think that came out of that traveling for me was sort of a realization that no matter who I met, no matter where they were, no matter the differences in our language, that we all had something in common. We were all, just the basic things that people want. They want to be happy. They want to be, they want food. They want shelter, and they want clothes. Just the basic fundamentals. And seeing a lot of that in terms of what people would talk about in terms of what made them happy and what was tough in their life for them. And it was just realizing everybody's dealing with the same thing. And if we can say hello to that, it makes our interactions with people very different. So that was sort of the focus of the work that I did over all the years. And involved in that work, part of it was working with people that were going through the dying process. And I had procedures that I would follow and practice with them as they were preparing for this event. And so that gave me a little different view of it as well, because what I found was it may sound strange to some people, but my experience was that I would accompany them. I would go at least part way with them on this journey to their next step. And so I think all of that background or that experience made this perhaps the near-death experience that I had perhaps a little bit different, because I was coming at it from a different place. And I was, I'd already set myself just through all the practice. I remember one teacher that I had way back there somewhere saying, what you're learning how to do through what we're teaching you is you're learning how to die. And it's like there's a lot of different levels of that, letting things within me die so that I could expand out a little bit more. But it was, after having the experience, it was like, oh, now I see what he was saying. And it is, through meditation, some of the practices that are around, you can start to let yourself move into that awareness level. And it's I think the best way to describe it. It's like it's a shift in perspective. And so for all those years, that was the focus of what I was working with people around, was just trying to get them to let go of whatever their current concepts of life were and allow themselves to experience something different, more broader spectrum.
Don, why were you drawn to working with people going through the final transition? And did you have any metaphysical training or anything that helped with that part of the experience?
Yes, The first training that I got, I went through a program that's non-existent anymore, but it was with, it was essentially learning how to channel via what at that time they called it a trance channel. Now they just call it channeling. And it was that place of where you'd go into a deep trance and you'd let come through whatever came through. And so then I went from that. I worked with, for a while, I worked with self-hypnosis with people. And that was another exploration. And early on in that, I remember one time working with somebody, and then it occurred to me, first of all, I wasn't hypnotizing her. She was hypnotizing herself, allowing herself to go into that state. Mm-hmm. And then I'd work with whatever suggestions we had come up with. And then it occurred to me one time that, you know, what we're doing here is we're not hypnotizing, we're dehypnotizing. Mm-hmm. She was opening herself up, that she had sort of been, I thought of it at the time, of she'd been hypnotized into believing that, you know, one way. And she was going beyond that and having memories that she really didn't deserve to have, you know, from our typical way of viewing people. I mean, she was too young. She was, you know, under surgery. She, you know, you wouldn't be able to hear the doctors doing major surgery and all that stuff. But she had a total recall of it all. So, and then remember when my father died, he died quite young. And he was 59 at the time. And it was about the time I was really starting to get into this stuff quite deeply. And I remember it was a 4 or 5 hour drive over to where he was. And on the way over, I just let myself sort of tune in and found ourselves having this conversation. And by the time I drove into town, it was like I was flying high. I mean, it was such a high to go into a different state and have this really direct communication. And I remember leading him through something. And at one point, as only my father would do, he got this kind of grin on his face. And we had gone out. I had accompanied him partway. And then we came back. And he looked at me and he said, "You mean like this?" And I'd been practicing some of the stuff for a while. And he took me on a ride. The only way I could describe it, he took me out around the universe in ways that I would never have expected. And then we came back and he said, "You mean like that?" And I said, "Yeah, that's it." And so, you know, the learning has come through the experiences. And with the work that I was doing with the organization that I had going, there were requests. Somebody would come in. I remember one time a gentleman came in with his wife and his son, and he was in the final stages of cancer or something. And so I worked with him for a little while, and then essentially sort of tuned into what he was wanting to do and got a real clear communication. He was ready to leave. And it's like, okay, I got that. But he didn't want his wife and his son to sort of experience that loss. And so we had a communication around that for a bit. And then after we were finished, then I talked with the wife and the son about, you know, letting him go if he wants to go. You know, that's up to him. And they said, okay, fine. They got it. They could hear what I was saying, how we hold on to, and that impacts somebody in those final stages. And They came back 2 days later to where I was operating at that time. And they came in and they said, we just want to really thank you, because we could start to get that. And as soon as we let go of him, he left. And it was like, oh, okay. And so that was sort of the starting point for me. And then people that would come in, take classes, people that I was training, whatever, they'd request, I've got somebody, my father's dying, would you go see him and, you know, play with whatever you play with him? And okay. And what I found over time was, first of all, when somebody was at that point, they're if they haven't made the decision yet, you know, then they've got a pretty good chance of healing themselves. If it's their time to go and they feel ready for that, then it's like you can be an assist in, if nothing else, giving them permission. Yes, it's okay. This is a part of life. This is a part of who you are. And working with that awareness that we're more than this body and we continue on. So what does that look like? And, you know, it's probably different for every person, but it was just helping them somehow, whatever I could do, assisting them to go through whatever they needed to go through to let go.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. One of the, go ahead. Yeah.
There are so many questions I want to ask and so much, you know, I want to contribute, but I'm really wanting to get to the story about what happened to you 4 years ago, and then what happened with that experience.
Yeah. Okay. That's actually my wife and I, we had Harleys, and we got into that, which for a lot of people got a lot of amusement out of. Here's a spiritual teacher that rides around on a Harley. It was a miscompute at the time, and for a lot of people. And we had gone down to Mount Shasta, and we were on our way back, and we're driving up through Central Oregon. And I came around a corner, and my wife was following behind me. And she said, all of a sudden, I started doing something weird as we were going around that corner. And so she knew something was wrong. And so she just headed for the side of the road and stopped. And she said when she stopped, she heard the crash. And what happened was when I was coming around the road, there were all these rocks scattered across the road. And it was, they called it gravel, but they were much larger than gravel. And I apparently was trying to dodge those, find a way through. They were big enough they'd take a bike down if you hit them wrong. And it's a fairly sharp corner, and apparently I got too close to the center line, or perhaps I went over it, or the lady coming the other way. Anyway, whatever happened, we collided. And that was it. And it was, we had stopped beside a stream. It was a really hot day, and we soaked our feet and threw water over our heads and stuff to cool off. And this was a little camp spot. And I remember very vividly riding my bike out of that and place and onto the highway, and then straightening out, going up the road. And that's the last memory I have from that point. And that was 15, 20 miles away from where the crash happened. So all that memory got wiped out. And I didn't become conscious for 2.5, 3 days before I finally came out of whatever state I was in. And the interesting part of it for me was, while I don't remember any of what was going on during that time on this level, I have vivid memory of what was going on that other level. And it just happened that when the crash happened, the first car that came along had this woman jumped out of the car and came running up to where I was lying and said, "I'm a nurse," and she happened to be whatever it's called, a type of nurse that dealt with what I was dealing with, and so she stayed there for, I guess it took about an hour. They got an ambulance up there, and then they called in a helicopter. It pretty much rearranged my body. I was slashed across the face. It smashed my nose, took one eyeball, messed that up. My leg was completely out of the socket and back in my butt, and the ball at the top of the leg, and had sheared the top of that ball off as well, we found out later, and shattered it between the hip and the knee, and tore the knee off, and broke it below the knee, and crushed my foot. I mean, things were a real mess. Rearranged my collarbone. It was just a whole lot of stuff going on. And so apparently when they got me to the hospital, the nearest hospital was in Richland, Washington. And by the time my wife got there, whole story behind that, but the doctor said to her, "We need to get him to Seattle, to Harborview Hospital. If he stays here, it's automatic. We take his leg because we don't have the equipment to deal with it." So they put me on another plane after they had determined that, and flew me into Seattle, and that's where 3-4 days later, or 2-3 days, 2.5-3 days later, I awakened, and then that was a whole process. That starts getting into that experience of what it was like out there, because I remember making a real clear decision. Do we want to get into this part of it at this point, or is that enough about the crash?
The crash sounds negative. So
it was definitely negative.
let's start finding out what happened as you dealt with that.
Yeah. Well, that whole experience, I mean, I've heard people describe their near-death experience as, some of the elements may be there of, well, there was somebody there to meet me, or I went down a tunnel of light or something and came out at the other end and I was let off someplace, or whatever the common experience happens to be. And what it in retrospect, what it felt like, I had been through that a number of times working with people that were in that process. And so the way that I experienced this was I was just riding down the highway having a good time, and the next second I was in this other place. And I can't say that I was sort of looking back, and yet I was. And it was extremely, the energy was extremely bright. And, you could call it as very light, a lot of light. Yeah, there was that. It wasn't harsh, but it was very bright and very clear. And I started going through, I believe at that point, some of my life, just looking at it. And the things that I was aware of, number one, there was absolutely no element whatsoever of judgment. It was, the closest I could describe it was pure love, taking into consideration that everybody's got their own sort of idea of what love is. But this was vibrationally, it was just a place of joy, ease, non-judgment, and absolute total beauty. And that's the way I experienced that. And I didn't, it's not like there was somebody there to meet me. It was a strange combination when I look at it from here of there was absolutely nobody else there, and yet there was everybody that I've ever come in contact with was there. Mm-hmm. Sort of outside of that duality of either or, no, both at the same time.
And so it doesn't sound like, I mean, it sounds like a beautiful thing. It didn't sound like scary or frightening or anything like that.
There was absolutely nothing whatsoever that was scary about it. And it essentially, it was like feeling like, oh, I'm home. You know, you've been out wandering around for, like, going on that trip for 3 years, wandering around the world and then coming back and sighing a sigh of relief in spite of, you know, I loved it all, but here I am now, I'm back home, I can let down or something. And it was that sort of feeling like I'm home. And it felt so familiar and so comfortable. And the other thing that I became acutely aware of at some point was, oh, I've got a choice to make. Mm-hmm. Am I going to stay here, or am I going to go back and crawl back in my body or be back in this dimension? And I actually considered that. And I remember being there and considering that. And all the things that I took into consideration, but then it was like, no, I'm going to go back because it doesn't feel like I'm really finished yet. It doesn't feel like I've done really what I wanted to do in this lifetime. So it's time to go back. And there was no pressure one way or the other. It was just totally a choice, being aware of making a choice. And so when I decided to go back, I made it, there was a condition that I hung on it. And it was like, okay, if I'm going to go back into my body, I'm going to bring this awareness level with me. And I'm going to have that in the body. And if I can't do that, I really question whether I'd want to go back. And when I talk about that awareness, it's like a state of being where you are something more than your body, and you're experiencing that on that full level that I was experiencing out that while you're in the body. And that's a little juggling act. It has been for me. And so it was, and I remember as I came into my body, and the body started to become conscious again. And I was aware that somebody was fooling around me. And it turned out it was a nurse, and she was straightening my covers or something. And then I remember, oh, I think I'm in a hospital bed. I'm not sure. And because I couldn't quite make that connection, because it was like I was there and I was here simultaneously. It wasn't an either or. I was both places. And I was aware of the vibration or the tempo or whatever you might call it, that light from there, and of bringing that into my body. And it's like very consciously saying, I need to bring that in, and pulling that into my body, and the effect that had on my body. I could feel it. It tingled from head to toe. It's like every cell in my body was taken to a vibrational level that it hadn't been used to. And mind you, I've spent 50 years working with vibrations and increasing the vibration of the body, but this was just out of sight. It was such a high frequency. And I feel like in retrospect, these 4 years since then have been adjusting to that energy and that awareness of self. And it's taken those 4 years for my body to adjust and to let go of any concepts that it was still hanging on to about what the universe was about, if that makes sense.
It's amazing. I mean, I got a million questions, like ridiculous things like, "Are you sorry you came back?"
I don't find that ridiculous at all. It's no, not in the least. I don't have a single regret about that at all. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. I'm glad I did, because it's given me a different experience of life. I see everything differently. I experience everything differently, and it's from a much bigger place is the only words I can find for that. Yeah, as a matter of fact, one of the memories that I have was after, I think I had been, it took 5 surgeries to glue me all back together. And somewhere in there, I remember waking up one morning and I was in and out. I think they had done 2 surgeries before I came out. And so there were 3 more. And somewhere in there, I remember the thought occurred to me, and it was just sort of off the wall. It was like, I think my body's in trouble. And it was like it took that long to even let that in. And because I was still in this dual existence, I was in these 2 places, and the other part about coming back that really, in retrospect, I think that must look pretty funny to the nurses, because all I did was lay there and giggle. When I became aware of bringing that vibration into my body, I started giggling. And, the nurse probably thought, well, this guy's so stoked up on drugs. Of course I was drugged, but it was difficult to take anything very seriously. It was like, because one of the things that I remember touching into, the word that came up for me when I came back to describe how we as human beings are existing today, is we're pretty petty. Everything's narrowed down into a very narrow, we can't, however we were raised, whatever culture we were raised in, whatever, if we were raised in a religion, whatever that was, it's like the narrowing down of our perception that takes place through our lives was just really accentuated for me. And from that bigger perspective, it just became absurd. And it was like, oh my, isn't this interesting? And that giggling went on. I spent 3 weeks in intensive care at Harborview, and then they sent me to a rehab place for, I think, 2 months. And it was the same through those whole almost 3 months. I was giggling all the time. And, this is after they took me off of most of the drugs. So I can't blame it on those. And, but it was just like, it was just a totally, totally different perception of life, what we're about. And part of that process too was experiencing sort of firsthand, if you will, what it was like to forgive yourself, to live in that state of non-judgment. and how I saw other people, but how I saw myself. And all of the mistakes that I made through my life, just took on a very sort of humorous side. I mean, it was like, oh, I did that. Whoa, how did I manage that? And it's like, well, that's not me. But there's this interface for me between these two states of being, and it's like, how do we find that interface and let ourselves have that awareness now? What I came, that I'm bigger than this, and I've chosen to be here, and in this body at this particular time, and being even more acutely aware of how our bodies are impacted and our actions and everything else by the vibrational sort of wavelength that we're operating within. Quantum science is, quantum physics is starting to point towards some of this stuff. And it's like, all the things that they taught on a metaphysical level out there now, so much of it is now being backed up by a lot of the work that's being done by, heavy duty scientists.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm loving that.
Yes.
And I'm glad I came back to see this even more, because so much has evolved even in the last 4 years.
Yes.
And it's very, to me, it's very encouraging in terms of where humanity as a whole is headed. There's all the garbage that's going on right now, but I'm just seeing that as sort of an eruption. All the stuff that's been so hidden is now so much more out in the open. And that's part of, we deal with that with ourselves. We have an experience in life, we go into denial of it, we tuck it away somewhere and pretend like it doesn't exist. Well, all of a sudden that's being shoved right out in our face. And so how am I going to deal with that level of awareness that I didn't even let myself know was there before?
Wow. That
Yeah.
amazing experience. Paula, do you have any questions?
Well, thank you so much for sharing this, Don. I just love, how you talked about that new level of awareness, and how it just seems that a lot of people's perspective on their life is so petty. I know that for myself, and it's been kind of on my mind lately, and it's probably on my mind, I don't really think so much about it, but, I can work in an environment that's very chaotic, but I just kind of get that perspective that, oh, it's just a chaotic environment. I can go outside and it's not like that.
Right.
But, I run into people every day, just my natural course of the day, and it's like the things that preoccupy people are like just don't really bother me.
Yeah.
And I used to wonder, well, maybe I've just had a long life and I've experienced a lot and it's just relative, but I know it's more than that.
Yeah.
It really doesn't, it's really not that important to me anymore, just all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think a lot of it comes from, as you were saying, that higher perspective, when you have that, and so now, what has transpired from that? Like, what do you feel for yourself that you do you have like a brand new purpose in life, or?
Oh God, that's an interesting question, because that's part of what I've been trying to get integrated into my body. Okay, now what am I going to do with this, if anything? And so I'm starting to, it feels like that's starting together. It feels like I could never go back to doing things the way that I did them before. It's a different place. As an example, I can't walk out my door. Outside, there's some trees out there. And I can't walk out that door and look at those trees without giggling. And I see them differently. I see the life force in them and the sort of tree consciousness, if you will, that's there. And then a squirrel will run by, and it's like, whoa, look at that. And the same thing with people. And what it feels, I used the word petty. The other thing, we all live in our own little universe. Let's put it that way. These are just my descriptions. Somebody else might put it somewhere else. But it's like based on our belief systems, which are based on how we were raised, which are based on, all our life. And it's like, when I look at that, everybody's in their own universe, and they're all pretty tiny universes. And when we start pushing the edges of our personal universe, when we start letting that expand, usually what it has to do with is needing to let go of concepts that we've taken on. Okay, and we get real challenged there, because the concepts that we've used, the reason we've used them and been attached to them is because they worked for us. And there's a reluctance to let go of that. And one of the things that, ways that I've heard this expressed by somebody recently was, you don't know what you don't know. None of us know what we don't know. And that's pushing those edges. Okay, what do I want to know? And for some reason, that was there for me as a small child. And some of the experiences that I had that would be considered, astral travel or whatever. And so it's like, what it feels like in coming in, I came in with, when I came back to my body, I came back with a universe that all of a sudden was much greater than what I thought was my universe before that. And have been pushing the edges ever since of that, and trying to get that integrated into the body. So it feels like it's just now starting to emerge as to how I want to relate to people that I might work with or whatever. And interestingly enough, timing on this, all of a sudden that's just opened up. And I couldn't go anywhere. And every time I tried to move somewhere, it just felt like, you're not ready yet. And now it feels like, okay, I'm ready now. So open the door, see what happens. So, I still don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but this is part of it right now, yes. What we're doing.
So physically, how are you feeling from the accident now? How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. They didn't, when the doctor finished the last surgery, he says, well, at least you'll have a leg to stand on. And that's all he'd say. They had no concept of whether I'd even be able to walk again. Yeah, I can walk pretty well. I still go to physical therapy a little bit. It's a progression, and it's been a slow progression, but it's continuing upward. And the rest of my body is sort of settled back into kind of what it was before. But it's not limiting me a lot in what I can do. Yeah, I can go for a walk in the woods. I can, go down by the ocean or stuff. I can't jog yet, but I'm close to it. And so the healing, I think, has been pretty amazing. There was one point, don't want to carry this on too far, but when I was in the hospital, I remember waking up one morning and I was all tangled up in the blankets. And I kind of went, what's this? And this nurse came in and she untangled me and got me laid out. And that was when I still had a brace on my leg, screwed into the bone, holding it together, trying to put it back together. And I thought, well, that was strange. And then the next morning I woke up exactly the same way, all wrapped up in my blankets and twisted around. And it occurred to me at that, what created this? And then it just came, I was trying to get out of bed. I was going to walk out of that hospital. And then the question that came up for me at the time is like, can I really pull this off? I know I got such a strong sense, shall we say, of the capabilities that we have. And I actually, another one of those conscious decisions. And I kind of like looked at that and I thought, if you can't pull this off, you may damage things even more than they're already damaged. And so I made a decision, okay, no more of that. And so I never went and never found myself in that state again.
Don.
I remember the thinking was, let it take its own, let this thing do its own thing in its own way. You're going to be fine. And it's like, okay, whatever.
Don, I have a question.
Yeah.
How did this experience of going to the other side and feeling all of the expansion and the support and the love, and how does that change the way you feel about the death and dying experience? I mean, we're all going to have to do that. What have you learned?
I guess essentially, why is there so much fear around this? Why is everybody so afraid of death? My experience of that was so easy. I mean, granted, I did it in a rather dramatic way, but it's like that passing through the veil, as they refer to it. To me, there was no veil. There's a veil here. Well, let's take that even further. It's like, how far do we want to stretch this out? But it's like, one of the things that I came away with from that experience was there is no out there. It's all in here. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. And while I knew that before, it was the experience of it.
Mm-hmm.
And am I responding to your question? I can wonder sometimes. Oh, how did that? Yeah. And so, I think, from my viewpoint, it's like people, it would be helpful for people to recalibrate themselves in terms of what that process is really about. And I think one of the ways of doing that's used a lot is meditation. It's that sort of thing to where you start to, through meditation, hopefully reach a state where you start to tune into yourself on a different level and have that be to the extent that you're making that real for yourself. It's no longer a concept. So ideally for me, I just like to see people approach this whole process with a little bit more lightness and looking at that happening over time. Say when I first started into this, look at maybe 50 years ago and how people viewed death. And now you have people that are having celebrations of life as an example. Okay, it's lightening it up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have my emotional response when if somebody that I'm close to dies. That's my problem, not the person that died. It's not their problem. And I watched another little story here, an experience with a woman. She was 95 years old. And this was a couple of years or 3 years before my accident. And I had known her for a long time. I was married to her daughter at one time. Okay. And we got along okay. It just wasn't a real tight relationship. And I'd been married to her daughter for 16 years. And but there was no place ever that I could ever talk to her about these things that I was interested in. And she was also a person that was very, very proper in everything. She would never dream of doing anything wrong, whatever. And so she announced to her daughter that she was going to leave on her 95th birthday. And her daughter said, okay. And then and this was a couple of months before her 95th birthday. And so ended up in one of those care places, whatever you call them, and not a hospice, but a elderly care center. And had this little apartment, and her daughter ended up spending a lot of time with her over the last couple of months because she needed taken care of, and her weight was way, way down and all that stuff. Well, she called me a couple of days beforehand. We were chatting, and I said, well, look, it would be useful for you if I came down there. And she said, oh, God, please. And I said, okay. And so the next day I drove down, and I walked in the door, and she's sitting on the couch. She just points to this door. And so I went over there, and it was this woman's bedroom. And so I walked in, and the blinds were shut, and a little dim light over in the corner. And there was a chair sitting beside her bed. And she was talking, very, very coherent talking. She had her eyes closed, and she was talking. And so I just pulled the chair up next to the bed and sat there. And pretty soon she opened her eyes, and she looked at me, and she said, oh, hi, Don. And I said, hi. And so we chatted for a minute, and she said, I'm talking with Jesus and with God, and I've told them I'm going to come to them on my 95th birthday, which is tomorrow. And I said, oh, okay, that's fine. And so I sat there, and she closed her eyes, and she continued on with this conversation. And so I started playing with the energy a little bit, and I thought, well, I'm going to match where she's at. And so I got there, and this three-way conversation was now a four-way conversation, and I was included in it. And it was like, whoa, this is a bit much. And, whatever communicated, that's how she was experiencing it. And it's like, okay. And then at one point, she flared her eyes open, and she looked at me, and she pointed up, and she said, there's no right or wrong out there. There's no good or bad. And I looked back at her, and I said, yes, I know. And she looked right straight in my eyes, and she was looking right straight through me, and she said, yes, I know you know. And I damn near fell out of that chair. It was like the last thing in the world I would have expected coming out of her mouth. And so anyway, I spent, I don't know, an hour and a half or 2 hours with her, I guess, something like that, and had a delightful conversation going on. And then finally said, okay, have a good time. And she said, a big grin on her face, she said, I will. And it's like getting ourselves into that mode And I had a similar thing with my grandmother. That was another whole story, but it was like that we can comprehend this in a very different way. We can take a lot of the charge out of it. It's just a transition. My experience was when I was out there, I had all the memory of this plane. I was there with me. I didn't just disappear into another thing somewhere. I was that consciousness that had been trying to occupy this body, if you can put it that way. And it was all intact, every bit of it. So
I want to ask, and other people might have some questions as well, but we're all masters. We've all had life experiences. The one that you've experienced was obviously significant, life-changing. The people that are viewing this video, what do you think they can learn from your experience or the story that you're telling? What would you say to them about how they should pay attention, either differently or refocus or emphasize?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It depends on what somebody's orientation is. If they've got a big interest in this because they've got a big interest in it. It'll be different than for somebody that's just off the street and has never heard of any of this or not, whatever. And everybody's coming from wherever they're coming from. But for me, the when you start poking around in these realms, there's just a whole lot more room for enjoying life for what it is, and seeing and being able to see this as our lifetime is a full experience, but it's not sort of restricted to this lifetime, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. There's so many other dimensions of ourselves, and when we start tuning into those, and it can happen very quickly and very easily today compared to what it did 50 years ago when I started. We're just in a different place. And it leaves a lot more room for joy and pleasure in the present day life as you're going through this. It leaves a whole lot more room for just lightening up around everything. I mean, I look at, in some ways, like all disease, all things that we go through, they're all vibrational. And any of those ailments, any of those things are usually a pretty low vibration. And a lot of the healing that can go on takes place at a higher vibration. And I'm in complete control of that. Every one of us are, even if we don't think we are. And that's one of the things I like about some of the meditation techniques and everything else. It helps to discover some of that. And it's like, what can people take away from this? That I'm finding that a really difficult question to answer, even for myself, other than, hey, lighten up, have a good time. I had an experience since I've been home from the hospital in these last 4 years, and I was walking around outside looking at the trees, and it was wonderful, and wondering what I was going to do when I grow up. And then all of a sudden there was this sort of internal dialogue, if you will. It could have been more than that, but it was like, so how long have you been doing healings? Oh, I don't know, 40, 50 years? Uh-huh. So you've been doing that for quite a while? Yeah, for quite a while. So you've probably accumulated a lot of information around this. And I said, well, yeah, I guess you could say that. I've got a bunch of information. And then the voice came back and said, you don't know shit. At which point I kind of pulled back and kind of went, okay, I got it. And it's like you need to let go of what you know in order to go into what you don't know. You don't know what you don't know from there. And so if you want to go there, you got to let in what you don't know.
Did you have any feel like you have guidance or support? Does God or Jesus or anybody walk around with you? And do you have any sense that there's more than just you supporting you as you do your daily activities now?
Oh my! Now you're getting into it. Yeah, of course. I mean, it's like, and there's a whole other aspect of this, and it's sort of like that. We're so used to duality, and we're so used to viewing everything through our duality or whatever sort of concept, and yet what I experienced out there, it's like what I was talking about. There was nobody else there. I was totally alone, and yet everybody else was there. And it's like, oh my, how do you compute this? Yes. Well, it's hard to even put it into language.
Yes.
And so while there's been over the years following along, it's like there's these, shall we say, guidance I could call on, and maybe I would, come up with a name or something. Oh, let's turn into, blah, 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 Archangel Michael or something. But over time, it's like, if you go back out to that other space, it's like we're all part of the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so I'm essentially dealing with myself on some level. Mm-hmm. And Santa Claus is out there reflecting back at me that I am Santa Claus. Mm-hmm. For myself, and so that's that. I don't look at this as better or worse or good or bad or anything else. It's just, where are we at in this particular time period individually. Mm-hmm. And so, and I'll be aware sometimes of an individual that I'm communicating with on that level, and other times it's like, I don't know who it is, and I really don't care, because the vibration that they're operating on, or the vibration that I'm touching into with this communication, feels appropriate for me right now. Mm-hmm. And can I stay with that? Yeah. So when we're opening the doorways out there, what we're really doing simultaneously is opening the doors in here.
Yes.
Yeah, and so, I think we've got an understanding of that, but to really experience it again, we need to allow ourselves room to move, to let ourselves experience things that maybe we can't explain.
Right.
Worry about the understanding later on. If I needed to understand orgasms before I ever had an orgasm, then I never would have had one. Mm-hmm. I needed to experience it first, then I can try to make sense out of it. And good luck with making sense out of it.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. We've been going at this for about an hour, so I think we need to wind it down. But
okay.
How do we get the word out? The people who really need to hear this or live differently with a different perspective, how can we use this information and help them so that they can live with less fear and anxiety and have maybe more enjoyment and joy and fullness in their lives?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question, and I've been dealing with that a little bit myself as I look at this next phase or whatever you're going to call it of what I'm going to be doing. And, my approach to that is I'm going to start a website. I've got it partially designed and just starting to try to make it visible for anybody that can find it, that's attracted to it. And it's like, if this little video that we're doing turned out really good, I'd want to send it to everybody I know and ask them to send it to everybody that they know, just so to start the ball rolling on that level. I've gotten some real surprises. I remember going into Starbucks up the street here one day and ran into a guy there that I knew, and we were chatting a little bit, and a guy came along that he knew. And we started talking a little bit, and the guy was in his 80s. And just to look up him in the way he was relating to us, I would never expect it in a million years for this guy to ask the question that he did. But at some point, the friend of mine said to him, Don was in a motorcycle crash, and he was saying this because this guy's son had just gotten in one and was surviving, and told him that I had had a near-death experience. And this guy whipped around and looked me right in the eye and reached over with his hand and took mine and says, "Oh God, tell me about it. I really want to know about that." And I kind of looked at him like, really? I would not have expected this. Very rigid kind of person. And yet, that's out there. And I think there's an awful lot of curiosity, much more so than we might think, with people.
Well,
and so I don't know how to crack into that. I don't know, other than getting it out there and where they can maybe see it. I don't know.
did you say that you have a website already?
No, I'm developing that, and
Because Masters of the Journey, that's what we're all about, is trying to create resources for the people. So we want to mail out to our lists what you have to offer, and then you'll mail out to your list what we have to offer. We're going to kind of like do the social media cross marketing of all of the resources and information.
Yeah,
and
that's a piece that feel like I'm pretty lacking in.
Okay, well,
I'm that older generation, that don't know about all these things that can be done with that. But whatever.
And you bring up a great point. Death and dying is the enemy in our culture. And yet everybody has to deal with it. And that's why to this talk that we're doing in January, there has been more interest and more people kind of coming out of the woodwork with at least, I don't know if they're going to show up, but they're interested. And I would like to get them there and start that chain reaction of, Don's story is not just read in a book. It's not just words about somebody else's thing. This is a guy that was in the room, and he has something to say. And that's what I see the whole process is to have you tell your story and have people start telling theirs. There's going to be a lot of people there with some experience, not the experience, but some experience.
Yeah. Well, that to me, that's kind of exciting. And it's like, and, I guess, what ideas will they have about getting this out?
Right. And in speaking to Bob Trask at Unity, I'm sure that when you get to know him and vice versa, he may have room for you to at least speak to, that other 50 to 100 people, or, make space so that your story can reach people And there are a lot of older people there.
Yeah, I know.
They may be like this guy that you saw who in his 80s says, I got to know what that was like, because they're a lot closer to having that experience than, say, the millennials.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
And I mean, this is all interesting timing for me, because I was just feeling actually over the holidays, just prior to, maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks ago, feeling like it's time to throw the door open.
yep, it is. That's
And
what we're doing.
yeah, for me personally, it's time to throw the doors open and walk back out there. And so doing this kind of thing, and then if the Unitarian Church, I'm available to go talk to people, that kind of thing, just to get it moving.
And Don, what you don't know is that Paul and Paula have also had amazing experiences. That I'm going to be doing a conference like this with Paul in the near future about an experience that he had when he was 19 that now he's coming to grips with and has changed his life. So we've got a lot of people who have got stories to tell.
Yeah, and over the years of teaching and dealing with the people that I dealt with, I became so acutely aware of people, they'd get into a space where there was permission for them to talk about something that they've been holding in their whole life, and it's like just that acknowledgement, oh, that's real, to have somebody else look at you and say, yeah, that's real, I've experienced that, I know what that's like. It's just, lifting the lid off this thing. I remember, for me, in growing up, some of the experiences that I had as a child, I had nobody to talk to. If I said anything to my parents, it was like, well, you're just making that up. It was that kind of thing. And then very quickly got the message, like in grade school, early grade school, and it's like, just shut your mouth. These are areas you don't go towards. And I think we all get that to a certain extent. I can't, it's not blaming anybody else. It's just that's the way things have been, but it's changed now. And when I look at these the younger generations, and I'm talking, the newest generation. I mean, there's a kid that's almost 2.5 years old now. And when he looks at me, when I come in the door and when I talk with him, he just starts jabbering. And I can't understand, but I can see what he's saying, and it's making total sense. And he's getting it all from me too. Everything, I mean, it's that wide open, yeah, this is a great space, let's explore this. And he's got parents that are absolutely, totally supportive of that whole thing. It's a delight to see. But it's like, from my generation, from your generation, from all our generations, it's such a different, that's become more real for me since that experience as well, how different it is now compared to what it was back then, and how fast it's moving. And so for me, something like this, broaching this subject with people that haven't been able, for one reason or another, to approach it for themselves, I think it's ripe. It's, there's a good, the interest is just getting stronger almost by the day.
Thank you, Don, very much for telling your story. I'm going to turn our recording off, and then we can kind of wind it down.
Okay.
Let me turn it off. Thank you, everyone.